Dark Side of the Ring was back this week with an episode on the late Adrian Adonis. And I learned a few things along the way that I did not know about before, including more on this Danny Spivey story. I don't know how I've never heard about this fight between them. Now that I've gone back, there have been plenty of shoot interviews from wrestlers talking about it, but that one was mostly new to me. When I first started watching WWE in 1987, Adrian Adonis was at the end of his run with the company. He was already the adorable one by that point. I never knew him from his days in the AWA with Jesse Ventura as the East-West connection, or later on with Dick Murdoch as the North-South connection. Adonis and Ventura, they came to the WWF together, but their run got cut short when Jesse retired due to blood clots in his lungs. That's when Adonis started tagging with Dick Murdoch, and the two of them actually held the WWF Tag Team titles until the beginning of '85. So they just missed that first WrestleMania as the champions. You know, we had Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik against Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda. But had it been, a little bit, had they held on to those titles for a few more months, they may have been on that very first WrestleMania. But this was the story of a talented wrestler who, like a lot of guys back during that era, let his drug addiction get the better of him. He was saddled with a gimmick that could be looked at as a burial, but this was during a time where everybody working for Vince McMahon had a gimmick. So what his actual intentions were with the character, we'll never know for sure. He tried to make the most of it. He ended up being fired. His weight and his health spiraled out of control. And by all accounts, he started to clean himself up just as his life was cut short at 34 years old in a car accident. And what if? What if Adonis had gotten another chance working in the WWF? How far would he have gone? It's a story that we've seen many times before on this show, where the drugs and or the booze lead them down this dark path to a premature death, and left in their wake is a broken family without a husband and without a father. You know, the wrestling business has far too many examples of this. They got Bret Hart for this episode. He shared a locker room with Adonis. He called him one of the best big guy wrestlers of all time. Dave Meltzer was interviewed for this. I can hear the heads exploding right now. He said Adonis was unique in that a guy his size should not have been able to move around and bump the way he did, yet there he was. He was taking the Ric Flair over the top corner bump at 300 plus pounds. You know, it's really jarring. You watch the early footage of him, and he's in great shape. And then you see how grossly overweight he became, and he was still pretty agile, but it's just really sad the way he let himself go, and the drugs, I'm sure, had a lot to do with it. And they talked about that in the episode. Obviously, with the Adonis gimmick, there was a lot of influence. I'm talking about the adorable Adrian Adonis stuff. Clearly, there was a lot of influence from Gorgeous George. And there were a lot of people, well, there was a lot of stereotyping in wrestling back then. Not only of gay people, pretty much everybody. No one was safe. There was plenty of stereotyping going on when it came to wrestling promos and wrestling gimmicks back then. It was pretty much the Wild West. But in this case, Vince had him doing a gimmick with the idea that it would get people mad. And you had lots of people carrying signs to shows that said, go back into your closet and chanting things at him that I won't repeat. They showed the clip of Adonis on the old Tuesday Night Titan show coming out and claiming he was gay. What type of reaction do you think they were trying to elicit with that? Adonis in real life, growing up, was about as far from that gimmick as you could possibly be. Everybody said that he was a tough guy, including his childhood friend from the old neighborhood in Buffalo. They had him on the show, this guy Anthony, who later did time in federal prison. In fact, he was in prison when Adonis died, which is why he couldn't attend his funeral. First, he and his friends started out as a high school frat before turning into a street gang, and they were fighting all the time, usually with Adrian winning. Eventually, he got bored with school. He dropped out to become a wrestler, while Anthony and all of his other friends ended up being wise guys. He ends up in the AWA, and they interviewed Greg Gagne for the episode and Jim Brunzell to talk about his time there. He held the tag team titles with Jesse Ventura. And then it was on to New York to work for Vince McMahon. And this is where Bret got to know him. He can remember Jim Neidhart bringing him being Brett, to Adrian's hotel room one night. Adonis was in there with a bunch of other wrestlers, Roddy Piper, the Iron Sheik, Mr. Fuji. You can imagine what was going on in this hotel room. And and Brett says that Adonis looks through the peephole and he sees Brett. And he says, oh, he's got Brett with him. And Brett was still wet behind the ears at this point, right? He's still new to this whole thing. And Anvil told Adonis through the door, no, he's cool. He's with me. He's cool. So they let them in. And Brett saw Adrian chopping up cocaine on a mirror. Well, where there's cocaine, I'm sure the Iron Sheik would be there, so. Brett said he did lines of coke with them until 4 in the morning, and it was a learning experience for him. Yeah, I'll bet it was. I'll bet it was. He said back in the 80s, guys would shake your hand just to pass you an 8-ball. It was basically like a starter kit. He said Adrian went hard every single night, and with cocaine, the deeper into it you get, the more of a monster it becomes. Not that cocaine in wrestling in the 80s is something we didn't already know about, but I love how Brett has no issue naming names. It's like they're all dead now anyway. So they can't defend themselves. They can't respond. Brett's just talking about 8 balls. He's dropping names here like the fucking doomsday clock is about to hit 0, and he just doesn't care. Yeah, he was snorting coke off the mirror, and Piper was there, and Fuji was there, and Sheik was there. He said cocaine wasn't the fun, friendly drug that everybody thought it was, and he and Anvil had to stop partying with Adrian because it was just getting to be too much. He was out of control. There's a reason that WWE's first ever drug testing policy was specifically enacted to test for cocaine. It was not a steroid policy. It was really a cocaine policy. It was that bad of a problem. And I don't think the company, frankly, even would have cared. But they were probably running into a situation where guys were doing so much coke that they were getting in trouble. They were probably unreliable. They were being late. Maybe they were missing shots. So now it's affecting the company. So now we got to put a policy in place to test for cocaine. And yet, when he was at home, around his wife and kids, he was like a totally different person. He didn't bring any of those issues home with him. To listen to his wife, who was interviewed for this, his wife B, he was a very kind, sweet man who bought her flowers and jewelry, who would make her breakfast in bed, and would call her multiple times a day when he was on the road. We heard from his 2 daughters, Angela and Gina, who talked about how much their dad loved watching the Three Stooges. It was always on television whenever he was home. But in the ring, his cocaine habit led to him getting heat backstage, and in particular with a young Danny Spivey, who was also interviewed for the episode. And Spivey looks great. It's hard to believe he's 70 years old. He looks tougher now than most people in the wrestling business. But for those who don't know, Danny Spivey, he played the Waylon Mercy character for a very brief period of time in WWE in 1995. But long before Waylon Mercy, he was a well-known name in the business, and he was one half of the Skyscrapers in WCW, first with Sid Vicious, and then when Sid got hurt, he tagged with Mean Mark Callis, who would go on to become The Undertaker. Spivey's back, though, was shot for that Waylon Mercy run. But if it was 5 years earlier and he was doing that gimmick, he could have taken that a hell of a lot farther than he did. But physically, by that point, he was washed. He was done. He couldn't do much. That was not the case back in 1986 when he ran into Adrian Adonis in the WWF. Spivey was still new to the business. He had only been in the business. I want to say maybe he had debuted a couple of years earlier. But he had a reputation as a tough guy himself. He was not somebody that you wanted to mess with. He bounced at bars. He did collections for people who owed debts. Right? He was not somebody you wanted to fuck with. And so long as you didn't, he was a sweetheart of a guy by all accounts. Adrian, though, whether it was the cocaine or it was just him being an asshole, I don't know which category Adonis falls into, but he was taking liberties in the ring with Spivey. He was being a bully. He was being a dick. And this was right when WWE was getting Adonis ready for a program with Hulk Hogan. So they have a match. Adonis took advantage of him. Spivey was furious. And he wanted to go after him after the match. But in the back, the British Bulldogs convinced him to just leave it alone, go cool off, put him in a cab, send him back to the hotel. This would seem to run counter to every Bulldog story I've ever heard. Like, if anything, I would think they would want to instigate, and they would want to stir the pot and just watch all the chaos unfold. But I guess not this time. Maybe they really like Spivey. But I'm pretty sure that was their match in Toronto at the Maple Leaf Gardens that aired on Primetime Wrestling. A couple of nights later, they're in Flint, Michigan. This, I don't believe, ever aired on television. But they're in Flint, Michigan at a live event. Spivey finds out they're scheduled to work together again. Adonis was supposed to wrestle George the Animal Steele. He wasn't there. He got sick, whatever the issue was. So they told Spivey, you're working with Adrian tonight. And he didn't mention it here in the episode, but in other interviews that I have since gone back through, because again, I had to just consume as much as I could because I didn't know all the details of the story. I found this fascinating. But in other interviews that he has done, Spivey said that he told Pat Patterson that night, look, I don't want to work with Adrian. Now, he didn't say this in the episode. In the episode, he's like, okay, yeah, whatever. Like, he wasn't thrilled about it, but he was like, okay, whatever. But he has said that he went to Pat Patterson, who was in the building that night. He said, I don't want to work with Adrian. Pat comes back later on and says, well, Adrian doesn't want to work with you either, but Vince says you're working together, so that's that. And again, Adrian starts to take liberties with this guy. Adrian had a sleeper hold finish back then he called Goodnight Irene. And he cinched on the Goodnight Irene real tight. He was trying to put Spivey out. Spivey just lost it. He had enough. Knocked Adrian out cold. Spivey said the referee yelled at him, hey, Dan, that's not the finish. And Dan tells him, I just changed the finish. He's not going over tonight, so disqualify me. What a badass line. What a great line. I love that. I love that. See, that's what Bret's mistake was in Montreal. He should have just gone with the flow, gone with the finish that Vince wanted. Oh, you want me to put him over? Yeah, sure. And then in the ring, he just shoots on Shawn Michaels and tells Earl Hebner, I just changed the finish. He's not going over tonight. So Bob Orton and Jim Brunzell, who knew going into this that there was bad blood at least from Spivey's end, right? And they thought something might happen. They run into the ring. They're pulling him off Adrian. They don't want him to kill him. So they're trying to pull him off Adrian. People are in the back. They're losing their minds. Spivey is taken to the back, and he is hot. He is angry. Well, now here comes Adrian Adonis. And as Brunzell tells it, and Brian Blair tells the same story. You know, it's amazing in going through all of the interviews I could find about this, from people who were in the locker room that night, some of the small details may differ, but for the most part, their stories are all remarkably consistent about what happened next. Adrian comes in. He goes to leg dive Danny. That was a mistake, because Spivey, he lands a huge left uppercut that sends Adrian flying, and blood just splatters everywhere. People who saw it said it sounded like a gunshot went off. His cheekbone was sticking out through the skin. Adrian came at him again, but he was kind of like stumbling around like a drunk man. Danny got off at least one more shot before it was all over. Adrian never got one shot in on him. And Blair describes his face as looking like a broken up piece of watermelon. He said it was gross. They could write a book about this story and call it Fucked Around, Found Out. The story of Danny Spivey and Adrian Adonis. Because this is the very definition of that. Hillbilly Jim was there also. And Hillbilly, you know, I've never heard anybody say a cross word about that man. He seems like the nicest guy. He was there. He says Pat Patterson was in the back. He was screaming, oh my God, stop them, stop them. And Junkyard Dog was there. Apparently, Adrian owed JYD some money over something. He hadn't paid him back. So Dog was pretty mad at him. So when Pat was screaming for somebody to break it up, Dog told him, no. Let him fight. Let him fight. Honky Tonk Man. He said that Adrian had to miss like a week after that. And I laugh when I hear that. Oh, he missed a week. But back then, you know, for a guy to miss a week or 2 weeks, that was a huge thing for them because they probably didn't get paid if they didn't work. And you know how guys were back then. They didn't take off for anything, right? If they got hurt, the attitude was just tape it up or pop some pills and just get back out there on the road. So actually, if Adrian had to miss a week, he probably was pretty fucked up. Spivey claims that Adrian needed 200 stitches in his face. Honky said that after that, they gave Spivey the nickname Dangerous Dan, the Left-Hand Man. Spivey said that he and Randy Savage became friends after because Randy also hated Adrian, even invited Spivey to his private dressing room that night after the fight, and Savage got ice to put on Spivey's hands. He said King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd thanked him later because they ended up getting the spot, splitting time working with Hogan instead of Adonis. And in fact, in looking it up, they were in Chicago a few nights later. Hogan worked with Bundy, who was subbing for Adrian Adonis. In the aftermath, Spivey has said that he had to call Vince McMahon the following day, and Vince told him, "I can't have you beating up my talent." To which Spivey told him, well, Vince, he wasn't very talented. And McMahon shot back, "Don't be a smartass." In the episode, Spivey said he got fired about a month later, which is not true. He continued wrestling there almost 2 more years. He was just an underneath guy, but he was always an underneath guy there even before the fight with Adonis. But he was still there through March of '88, which is definitely not a month later. As for Adrian, Brunzell doesn't think he was ever the same after he took that beating. Meltzer said when you're a guy who's feared, when you're perceived as this tough guy, and you have the reputation that somebody like Adrian had, and then you get your ass kicked like that in front of the boys, you lose face. So he spiraled further into drug addiction. He started binge eating, which is when he gained all the weight. And really, the weight gain started earlier than that. When he started tagging with Murdoch and they were the tag team champions, you could see the difference in his physique even then, and that was in '84. But again, when I first started watching, and my earliest memories of Adrian Adonis, I mean, he was gigantic. So he went on to work with Roddy Piper in WrestleMania III in what was billed as Piper's retirement match because he was leaving to go film the movie They Live. It's one of my personal favorites. It was also hair versus hair. And when Adrian lost, Brutus Beefcake came to the ring, shaved his head. I believe that was the birth of the barber gimmick for Brutus, which was the best thing that ever happened to Ed Leslie because through all the terrible gimmicks that followed, the one he still makes money off of today and is most remembered for is the barber. And it's also when he was at his most over, was tagging with Hulk Hogan, because in '89, when they were working Macho King and Zeus, Beefcake was never more popular than he was during that period. And then just like that, coming out of WrestleMania III, within probably a couple months, Adrian was gone. Now, there are different versions of why. The reason listed in the After magazines at the time, believe it or not, was dress code violations. That it was a recurring thing, and finally Vince just had enough and he fired him. Now, I have a difficult time believing that was the only reason they stopped using him, but it's the main explanation that I've seen for it. Adrian then shows back up in the AWA. And he is pushing 400 pounds. I mean, just, it's sad to see. He's working with Greg Gagne. Gagne says they barely made it 10 minutes in the ring and Adrian was sucking wind so bad. And he asked him after, he goes, "Adrian, for God almighty, like, what have you done? Like, you got to get yourself back in shape." And he says that maybe that helped. Maybe that was the wake-up call Adrian needed because after that, he dropped almost 100 pounds over the next 6 months. Now, they didn't mention this, but in the AWA in '87, Adrian Adonis was managed for a brief period of time by a young Paul Heyman as Paul E. Dangerously. He was one of the first Heyman guys. After that, he ditched the adorable gimmick. He worked in Japan for a time in '88. He was even teaming with Murdoch again. He was wrestling for the IWGP Tag Team titles at the end of June. Spivey says that he and Adrian even ran into each other in Tokyo at a popular steakhouse where all of the American talents would go. It's got to be Ribera. It's got to be Ribera. Got to be Ribera Steakhouse. He said they had a beer together, shook hands, they hashed things out. So that was nice to hear. Brett said that he had dinner with Adrian and his wife, and he seemed like he was really getting his life back on track and getting his act together. He was still young enough, where he really could have done so. So he had just flown home from Japan, and he was headed right back out for a Canadian tour. And he met up with the Kelly twins, Mike and Pat, who were an identical twin tag team. I was not familiar with the Kelly twins. I took one look at them. They look like a couple of, Irish lumberjacks. We meet Mike Kelly, who was the lone survivor of the crash that killed Adrian Adonis. Brett said they worked for his father in Stampede. He knew them from, way back in the 60s, the Kellys. You never knew which twin you were talking to. Mike said that he and his brother, they were inseparable. Inseparable. This was to me, this was the saddest part of the episode. Listening to Mike talk about how much he loved his brother, and his eyes were welling up and he was getting all emotional because it really did sound like his brother was his best friend and they did everything together. And the trauma of losing your twin and just the way it all happened is just devastating. So they were booked to work in Newfoundland in the main event with the Kelly twins against Adrian and the Bear Man. The Bear Man was not only a wrestler, the Bear Man was a promoter. And his whole gimmick was that he wrestled bears, and he trained Terrible Ted. Terrible Ted the wrestling bear. Dave McKigney was his name. Scott D'Amore, I think, has whatever remaining tapes there are of the last shows McKigney's promotion ran. I don't know if they've ever been aired anywhere. I think some of Sabu's earliest matches, when he was a rookie, are on there, because Sabu worked some shots for the Bear Man. So again, I don't know if that footage is available anywhere, but the last I remember reading is that Scott D'Amore had the tapes. Working with bears sounds like it would bring great risk. And it did, for his poor girlfriend, who got mauled to death one day, and they even showed the newspaper clippings of what happened. It was July of 1978. He had another bear named Smokey, and he left the cage door unlocked. He went to go take a phone call. And that's when Smokey the bear, he entered the house. And his girlfriend was taking a shower. Dave's, not Smokey's. His girlfriend was taking a shower, and they reenacted the scene here like something out of Psycho. We got the silhouette of her in the shower. I'm sure it was not a very pleasant way to die. This was a 7-foot-tall, 460-pound bear that was in heat, according to the police report. So I'm listening to all this. I'm listening about the Bear Man and what happened to his girlfriend, and he was promoting his own shows. They should have devoted an entire episode this season just to the Bear Man. I just find this all fascinating. So anyway, the mayor of Lewisport invites the wrestlers to a party that they were throwing in their honor, and I think they were also going to, use it for promoting the upcoming shows. So in one car were the Kelly twins, the Bear Man, and Adrian Adonis. It was actually Pat Kelly's van. Ricky Johnson, the brother of Soul Man Rocky Johnson, which would make him The Rock's uncle, he was interviewed for this as well. He was also a wrestler. He said he was about to join them in the van when somebody else offered to give him a lift in their car, so he went with them instead. Talk about a close call. Pat's driving the van. All the reports that I have ever seen said that Mike was the one driving. Even if you look up reports of the incident, it always mentions Mike as the one who's driving. In the episode, though, Mike said that it was Pat who was driving. It's kind of like the moose story. For years, it was a moose that they swerved off the road to avoid. In the episode, Mike says it was not a moose, it was a bear cub. And they swerved, or Pat swerved to avoid it. They went off into a ravine, and it was maybe a 15-foot drop. And they hit a rock in the water head on. Mike says he fainted. When he woke up, he felt this ice-cold water on him, and he was wondering, why am I in this stream? And that's when he looked over, and he saw his brother slouched over the steering wheel, and he was dead. He knew right away. He knew right away that he was gone. Ricky Johnson was in the other car, maybe 10 or 15 minutes behind them, and they got stuck in traffic, which was very unusual for where they were. It was probably a very remote area, and they probably don't have very many traffic jams in that area, so he thought there must be some kind of an accident. When they got closer, he recognized the red van in the water as Pat's van, and he said it's an image that haunts him to this day. The Bear Man died instantly. Pat was dead. Adrian was still alive, but he was in very bad shape. He was moaning for someone to help him. Ricky claims the bone was sticking out of his elbow. Now, what I've read, and this was not mentioned, is that Adrian was ejected from the back seat and he landed in a brook. That's from the police report. And it said that he died a few hours later at the hospital from a fractured skull and a broken back. But the most disgusting part of this whole thing is that 2 members of the road crew who worked for the Bear Man, they jumped in the water and they robbed Adrian of his money, his valuables, his watch, whatever he had on him. They just robbed him blind. while the man is lying there dying, because he didn't die until later on in the hospital. The man is lying there dying, begging for help, and they robbed him. They picked his pockets, they took his money, they robbed him. And they shared a newspaper clipping about one of the men being charged with theft. Adrian's wife said that she wanted to press charges, which I assume she did. And she said, why rob a dead man? I could tell you why. Because there are a lot of sick fucking people in this world, that's why. They robbed him and they left him there to die. Adrian had just come straight over from Japan. So he was carrying a lot of cash on him. I don't know if he had all the cash on him in the van with him. He had some of it, if not all of it. One of Adrian's daughters, Angie, posted a comment on YouTube under a Sabu video talking about this, saying they actually robbed him at the hotel also. So these scumbags did not waste any time. He was probably still lying in the water, and they not only robbed him there, they picked the hotel room clean also. They knew the hotel they were staying at. They probably just rushed to the room and got access to the room and then cleaned out whatever was in there. Mike says there were no drugs or alcohol involved in the accident, that the doctors checked him for all that. They tested his blood alcohol content. He was clean. And when the producer asked if anyone in the van was drinking, he said, no, definitely not. So he says nobody was drinking. Brett said if the accident never happened, it's not impossible to conceive that 5 years later we could have had Bret Hart against Adrian Adonis at WrestleMania. I don't know about that, but he was only 34, so if he got himself cleaned up and lost the weight, I definitely think he could have gotten another run working for Vince. It probably would have been in a different gimmick, because everybody had to have a gimmick during that time. I mean, Tony Atlas came back, he was Saba Simba. Iron Sheik came back, he was Colonel Mustafa. So who knows what Adrian would have been. The rumor is that he had a standing agreement to come work for Crockett before he died, back in his old gimmick, just as Adrian Adonis with the leather jacket. Turner, though, acquired Crockett and formed WCW a few months after the accident, so who knows, right? Who knows how that might have affected him, if they still would have even brought him in. One more little note that wasn't mentioned. Adrian was booked to work for Killer Kowalski after he finished up that Canadian tour. And even though he never got to work those dates, I think it was like 2 or 3 dates, Kowalski still sent his payoff for those shows that he was supposed to work to Adrian's widow. He didn't have to do that, but that's very cool that he did. So this episode, it took a turn that I wasn't expecting with the bear stuff. I mean, there was some interesting stuff in this show. And Mike Kelly talking about his brother, it really got to me. I was just waiting for somebody to come in off camera and just give this guy a hug. I enjoyed the episode, though. I think it helped also to have Spivey there to tell his side of that crazy story. This Tuesday, get your forks out. It is the Abdullah the Butcher episode.